Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this presentation at our Citizen 2020 COVID edition conference. This is Big Data Literary Analysis. I'm Harvey Quamen. I'm a professor of English and Digital Humanities at the University of Alberta. My RA, Joel Butchinger, couldn't be with us today to present, but just like to give a little shout out to Joel for all of his work. Thanks. Well, there are really two major questions that I'd like to engage today. They both involve literary style, and these are some questions that have preoccupied me for a little bit. So you may have seen me present on similar ideas in the past. But the first is that I'm interested in bringing new computational techniques to this idea of literary style. We're going to talk about that a little bit today, and especially what can we do about data visualization or with data visualization to help us understand style in perhaps some new or intuitive ways. The second question, and I'll talk about this a fair bit today, is that I'd like to try to understand literary style at a deeper level than just word frequencies. I'd especially like to think about what it means for literary style to be grammatical, or what kinds of literary style are possible at the deep levels of language where grammar happens. For those of us who've worked in stylometrics or text analysis in the past, the favorite tool that we've used, the kind of lingua franca of text analysis, has been the word frequency list. So we take our texts and we chuck them into a frequency counter, and we get some lists of words and the number of times that they occur in a text. And text analysis is in many ways comparative, and so we compare one side to the other. We see if words occur at the same rankings in the list, or if one text uses words more frequently than the other, or conversely, one text uses words less frequently than another. And we can even see words that are unique to any text. Now, in this case, Hamlet uses the word Lord more often than does E.B. White's short story, Once More to the Lake. Choice here is really the operative function of literary style, word choice and diction. Richard Ullman suggested that you can only really see style where choice happens to be a meaningful concept for an author. So what I'm interested in is what kinds of choices are available at deeper grammatical structures of language, where you have to put things together in certain patterns. We have to have certain kinds of inflections. We use nouns and verbs and clauses and phrases, and we put in punctuation in particular ways where everybody kind of knows the same rules. Tom Corns was really interested in this too. And in Milton's language, he wrote about why Milton is so difficult sometimes to understand. And he said that beyond the discourse or the word choices, that it's actually often grammatical. And this is one of his ASCII art diagrams of one of John Milton's sentences. And in fact, here it is. It's from Book 4 of Paradise Lost. I won't go through all of the details about how Corns labels ABCD, all of the subclauses here, except for the last one, which Corns says is the most important one, Clause A, and that it occurs at the end of the sentence, so that we have to work our way in this diagram from left, more or less, to right, through clauses like B and D and G and E and H, and then C and a whole subtree of clauses over there, before we finally get to the main clause of A, which is where the sentence resolves itself. There's also a little bit of a hierarchy going on here too. Corns puts clause A at the top, which means that it's more important. So the things that are the most important in that sentence are going to go to the top. There is an implicit timeline from left to right, so the first things we encounter in the sentence are towards the left, and the later things we encounter are towards the right. Now, there are other tools that we can use. In fact, Corns didn't use any tool at all. He just created these by hand. But there are other tools that we can use in order to do this. And one of these is in the Natural Language Toolkit, which I know many of us have used, NLTK. It's one of the really top-notch toolkits for natural language processing and for text analysis. The NLTK has a tree parser diagram and diagram drawer in it. And so we can actually take that same sentence and we can put it into NLTK to see what NLTK gives us, which is this. This doesn't look anything like what Corns is doing. And I'm not even going to zoom in because it's just too detailed, but it's just a complete schmozzle here. But I did want to point out the relationship between what NLTK is doing and what Corns is doing. So here's Corns' diagram. And again, I've circled that clause A, which is the one that Corns thinks is the most important, and I've circled it here on the NLTK diagram so you can see where it goes. They both occur on the right-hand side of the diagram because they both occur, obviously, it occurs at the end of the sentence. But whereas Corns puts it at the top because it's really important for the overall structure and the overall meaning of the sentence, you'll notice that NLTK doesn't. In NLTK's interpretation, that is subordinate to every other possible thing in the sentence. It just doesn't have the same kind of priority that it does in Corns' estimation. So one of the things that I'm interested in here is the automated use of tools like this. I would love to be able to build a kind of a big data sentence visualizer in this regard, but I'm not necessarily interested in having to match Corns necessarily, but I am very interested in the way that these various tools interpret the sentences and weight the different hierarchies of what's happening. Corns has a couple of other of these. He only really does about 3 sentences. They're all kind of ASCII art, impressionistic versions of literary style, but I just wanted to show you one other one so you can kind of see. Here's another one that kind of keeps sprawling down to the left, and the main clause here on the right-hand diagram is up and to the left. So it's one of the first things that we encounter in that sentence. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about what's going on in these two tools, and no, I don't want to go very far down the grammar rabbit hole here, but one of the things that's happening in between these sentences is this difference between a hypotactic sentence and a paratactic sentence. Historically, in English, we've had both of these. Hypotactic sentence is a sentence in the way that we might think about it today, in the way that we would teach our students, or maybe the way that we learn, those of us of a certain generation who have ended up diagramming a lot of sentences in our youth. These are what's happening. These both, by the way, are from Dolores Burton's book, Shakespeare's Grammatical Style. This was her PhD work at Harvard in the 60s, using a computer to analyze the grammatical style of William Shakespeare. So both of these examples are from her book. They're both from Antony and Cleopatra. So here, our slippery people begin to throw is the main clause of that sentence, but the subordinate part, whose love is never linked to the deserver till his deserts are past, is a modifier of slippery people. And so as a diagram, we would nest it hierarchically underneath the concept of people. It has a hierarchical, almost vertical kind of a structure where the phrase whose love is never linked is subordinate to that noun, a concept of people. A paratactic sentence, on the other hand, doesn't really have that kind of hierarchical nested thing. It's more horizontal, it's flat, it's just coordinated with a bunch of things like and or but or not or something like that, right? So here's Dolores Burton's example, which is what, and, with, but, right? Also from Antony and Cleopatra, but one kind of sprawling sentence. This is the kind of thing that we would drum out of our students. We would say, look, you're going to have some comma splices in there, right? So make these really short sentences. Don't have a run-on sentence. Don't let this get out of your control. And this is the sort of thing that we would try and weed out of our sentences or out of our students. However, these paratactic sentences historically are crucially important. And in fact, hypotactic sentences are kind of the new kids on the block, if you want to think about them that way. So understanding paratactic sentences is really crucial because both NLTK and Thomas Corns assume every sentence is hypotactic. So NLTK assumes that this is a nested, vertical, hierarchical kind of a structure, and so it diagrams it in exactly that way. Corns also assumes that these sentences are vertical, hierarchical, nested, and in fact, he cheats a little bit. If it isn't that, he turns it into that, right? But Ronald Emma wrote a long time ago that despite Milton's classical learning, right, Parataxis is a fundamental element in John Milton's prose and an influence on his poetry. And just as we saw Dolores Burton saying that that was an important influence on Shakespeare as well. So what I wanted to do is to think a little bit about parataxis and to try to approach that problem of parataxis computationally. Now, I'm going to focus on Milton here for a little bit, but this could apply to other writers of the early modern period, especially those who were steeped in Latin in grammar schools. John Hale writes a book, Milton's Language, and he talks a lot about the stylistic conventions that Milton adopted from Latin. Milton was he was as fluent in Latin as he was in English, and many writers of his period probably were. Hale points to one and through the book a couple, but one particular kind of Latinate construction called the ablative absolute. In English, we would translate the ablative absolute as something like with a noun of some kind having been verbed. Here's a little screenshot from a YouTube video. If you're ever stuck in a corner and you're on a desert island and the only way you can get off is by learning a little bit of Latin, this Latin tutorial on YouTube is a terrific thing. They're very, very short videos, but they're really good. And here's one of their examples for ablative absolutes, right? Caesar exceptis literis. All right. Caesar exceptis literis. Literally, with the letter having been received, Caesar sends a messenger. Now, the one thing about the ablative absolute, the reason it's absolute is because that phrase or clause stands outside of the main clause of the sentence. The subject of the sentence cannot be in the ablative absolute. The verb, the main verb of the sentence, cannot be there. The direct object cannot be there. So it stands apart from the sentence. Almost in a parallel paratactic structure. In English, if you've taken Latin, there are a number of ways you can translate the ablative absolute. It usually signifies some sort of a causal relationship or a temporal relationship. Here, I think it establishes something about the context at that moment. But you can, in fact, translate ablative absolutes as subordinate clauses. Old English had a kind of an absolute structure like that as well. And so Hale writes that Milton's readers probably knew something about these absolute kinds of grammatical structures, whether they got them from Latin or whether they got them from any other kind of a language. He makes the case that these were really important to Milton, but what else is interesting, he only points out one of them. So, of course, my question is, can we find more? And if so, how? The computer doesn't really understand an ablative absolute, so we have to think about other ways to find it. One of those is that we can use part of speech tagging as a way to decipher where these things might actually reside and live. NLTK has a part of speech tagger, but I have found through trial and error that it doesn't actually work very well on Milton. This one works a little better. This is the clause tagger. This was from the University of Lancaster. It was used to tag the British national corpus, which is about 100 million words of mostly 20th century English. So it still struggles a little bit when it gets to 17th century English, but it did a much better job with Milton than some of the other taggers that I looked at. Here's the kind of thing that you'll get. This is the first section of Milton's essay, Areopagitica. And you'll notice that instead of a word frequency count here, what it does is it takes those words and it appends a suffix, and that suffix tells you what part of speech it is. And so you have to go look at the clause tag set to see what all of those special codes mean. But you'll notice a couple of them here. There's one kind of down towards the bottom. No, I lost it. No, there's IW with or without as a preposition. That preposition will become important here in just a minute. This is the only ablative absolute that John Hale points out of the entirety of Paradise Lost. So our envious foe hath failed. This inaccessible high strength, the seat of deity supreme, with us having been dispossessed. And so there's an implicit with here, but the structure is exactly the same. And Hale claims that this is an ablative absolute. So what we can do is we can take that passage of Paradise Lost and we can run it through the part of speech tagger to find out what those things are. Us, of course, is a pronoun in the objective case. Dispossessed is a verb. And what I'm interested in now is actually looking at that grammatical structure and getting rid of the words and retaining only the parts of speech themselves, which looks a little bit like this, even more abstractly. And so what you can see here in the yellow between the commas is that there's an implicit with there, which is an IW tag, followed by a preposition, followed by a verb. And that's the kind of structure that we would like to look for in the computer. Those of you who have done a lot of computer work, one of the popular tools for this are regular expressions, but I chose to go a different route because I think it's a little easier to program, a little faster even as well, which is to use finite state machines. So in a finite state machine, what we can do is look through our part of speech tagged text, looking for the first tag in a structure like an ablative absolute. So the with preposition is an IW tag. So we can look to find a part of speech that happens to be an IW. And if we find that, you can see here in the blue-green, we can color code that. We will set a state in our Python code or whatever we happen to be writing that we actually have now a preposition. That the status of our context, the status of our environment right now is that we have a preposition. And then we'll just continue one by one looking at all of the other words to see if we can find something that's in that pattern. So if the next word or any other word in the sequence happens to be a noun or a pronoun, that's the kind of thing we're looking for. And in that event, we will advance our state. If we have any other kind of word, in this case it's bold, which is an adjective, it is code JJ. That's totally obvious, of course. In this case, it's just a JJ, and so we have a different kind of part of speech there, and so we just ignore it, and we stay at the status of have preposition. When we get to the next word, which is a noun, then we advance our states, and now we have a noun, and so we have moved on, and then we just keep repeating that process. Now we will look, we need a terminal verb for an ablative absolute. If we look at the a word and we get a part of speech that is a verb, then we will move on to a new state. If it happens to be anything other than a verb, we just loop back. We stay at the status called have noun. In this case, breaking is in fact a verb, and so we move on, and now we're at the status have verb, and that's a success condition for us. So we have a preposition followed by a noun or a pronoun of some kind followed by a verb, and that structure is very likely, or could likely be an ablative absolute. And in fact, I think it is. This is one of about 250 of such constructions that I found in Paradise Lost, simply by running a finite state machine there. So here the sentence is that Satan thus began, but the ablative absolute is with bold words breaking the horrid silence, right? So we're with bold words having broken the horrid silence. Well, that brings us close to the end here today. I had hoped, until COVID happened, that my RAs and I could take some of these ideas and run them through a giant corpus of texts. And in fact, we have collected a giant corpus of text, and we've done a lot of part of speech tagging. But when COVID happened, we couldn't really have access to the proper computers, and so that part of our project still just remains a bit unfinished. So I wish I'd had more examples for you today, but maybe next time. But still can point to a couple of conclusions that I think are really important. And number one is we actually need more authoritatively edited old texts, especially texts that have old spelling and old punctuation. And even though I didn't put it on here, old texts that are properly part of speech tagged. So even the clause part of speech tagger, which is pretty robust and doesn't really flinch at much, still makes some mistakes when we get back to Milton, and I'm sure Shakespeare, although I haven't tried that. Now, we do have some projects on the go, and many of you know about those EBO TCP, Early English Books Online Text Creation Partnership, and Laura Mendel's EMOP project, Early Modern OCR project, are really, really, really good starts, because we'll get old spelling, we'll get old punctuation. But we have to retain all of those old grammatical structures too. And so one of those things is actually punctuation. Punctuation was not used in the 17th century or the early modern period like we do. And in fact, all of those things that we would call a run-on sentence, they were completely happy about. And so I think in order to do this project and to do a project like this really well, I think we need to respect that old spelling, respect that old punctuation, and respect those old grammatical structures like those paratactic sentences. Could go farther in maybe a talk later about left and right and center embedding sentences, but these really kind of come out of transformational grammars and Noam Chomsky and things like that, and those transformational grammars are all hierarchical again too, right? Hypotactic. The other interesting thing though about today's talk, and I'd be happy in the Q&A if we could, if anybody knows of some other resources, is that a lot of these contemporary tools contain embedded assumptions about contemporary grammar, and that those tools don't work very well on some of these older texts. What I think is interesting and shows some promise is that we can actually use some clever algorithms, like a really, really, really simple finite state machine, to help to cope with some of those older sentence structures and to find certain kinds of grammatical structures that are not necessarily hierarchical, that are not necessarily embedded. And finally, I'm interested in data visualization, of course, and even though we haven't done much today, we did draw a couple of tree diagrams. I'm really interested in how we can leverage some of those contemporary tools and some of our savviness about what makes a good data viz in order to come back to these concepts about literary style so that we can make them more intuitive and more straightforward for people. All right, well, thanks very much. That's it today for Big Data Literary Style. Thanks for your time and attention, and looking forward to the Q&A during our session. Thanks.